Hello, this is Stephanie. I hope you can all hear me okay. Welcome to today's forum. I am going to be looking for your questions in the question and answer tab on the forum screen. So feel free to go ahead and shoot me questions, and I will take them as they come. Let's see, I'm going to open up the chat box and see. We've already got some participants here. So let's go ahead and get started. So good afternoon. I am Stephenie Bailey, and I am the Education Program Manager and Preservation Consultant at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. I have worked at the Conservation Center for 10 years, 3 of those years as a conservation technician in the housing department, and additional years in the preservation services department, developing and presenting a variety of collections care curriculum for clients. Open to hearing any suggestions that you might have for educational programs that the center can bring to the field for you. I was particularly excited to be invited to present October's forum of Putting Best Practices into Practice, Scalable Preservation Solutions, because selecting, designing, and constructing preservation quality housings is in fact very scalable. Challenges are a terrific topic for this series because I'm sure you all know sometimes top-notch boxes, custom enclosures, or perhaps a large quantity of photo sleeves, for example, is cost or space prohibitive. But making adaptive accommodations is totally and always acceptable. So we can talk about those scenarios today as question via the forum. So I am going to put a disclaimer, let's say, on the forum for today, because in our field there is the concept of good, better, and best. Let's just recognize that any steps towards improving housing scenarios for artifacts is positive, even when the ideal is not achievable. And we can talk about some of the adaptations to housings in your scenarios. A lot of times the ideal is not possible, but we be open-minded to variations, let's say. So I should mention at this point that the series Putting Best Practices into Practice, Scalable Preservation Solutions is funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. Thank you to them for their support of this forum. So I thought I would start in the beginning of the forum just for a minute or two to offer a few general observations on preservation housing, and then we will dive right into your questions. I like to think of the artifact enclosure as the first line of defense, if you will, between an object and its ambient environment. That is, housing is the most intimate layer of protection against forces in your building envelope. And your building envelope is within your local climate. And then additionally, your artifacts are subject to regional and even global influences from agents of deterioration. Simplified comparison, I think of a housing like a Matryoshka doll, and the artifact is nestled within a series of conditions, the housing being that teeny tiny, smallest container for your artifact over which larger circumstances are layered. And the larger circumstances, that the bigger Matryoshka dolls, if you will, are more costly and complicated to manage than a preservation housing. So trying to find an appropriate preservation housing for an artifact is a great step in your collections when other elements are harder to control. An enclosure, although, because it is in direct contact with your artifact, provides the best rigid support for it. So if you are dealing with paper artifacts that need a little extra support, a housing is going to be your best and most immediate fix. An enclosure can also provide additional seconds or minutes of protective safety to an artifact when sustaining disaster conditions like water or fire damage, because the housing and not the artifact is absorbing the damage. And an enclosure can even be purposely selected to contain certain additives that absorb pollutants from the surrounding environment. So in some ways, under some circumstances, a housing can be working for us without us having to have any conservation concerns to worry about. The material of the housing is working for us without us having to put forth any effort. In our collections, I suspect that most of us are using housing as a handling tool. So if a user can see information like an image or the text about an artifact on a housing without having to touch or jostle the artifact within the housing is successful. And so to that end, I always suggest clear sleeves whenever possible. And in that way, you can eliminate having to slide paper documents in and out of opaque sleeves. I recommend always properly and clearly labeling any housing on the exterior so that a user knows exactly what to find within the housing, eliminating any needless handling. And I say go ahead and include lots of instructions for how to access an artifact through complicated housings. If your housing has a lot of spacers or trays, go ahead and specify top versus bottom, or number the order that the tray should go back into the housing. These are just small ways that you can eliminate physical damage to an artifact because of user mistake. And lastly, it seems somewhat obvious, but a safe housing is also the way by which an artifact should be transported through your laboratory or your reading room. In other words, don't carry uncovered or unsupported artifacts through spaces. And when an artifact is not being accessed, it should be snug within its housing. So those are my introductory comments and general guidelines and concepts for preservation housing. And I am ready to welcome your questions now about the particular scenarios that you have in your institutions. And perhaps we can come to some scalable solutions for your particular situation. So let's see, I will go to the question box now and we will see what we have. So, hi Elaine, I am reading your question, which is, it seems you have a collection of 350 pamphlets, which are about 200 years old, and they're currently housed in Glassine envelopes inside archival envelopes. And you're asking if those, if you should replace the Glassine with Mylar L sleeves and use a 4-flap enclosure. Yes, and the reason is because Glassine is no longer a recommended material to come in contact with the surface of many different kinds of paper artifacts. In fact, it's been proven with changes in relative humidity that glassine can actually pop, bubble, and crack with quite a wide irregularity. And so I would suggest that you have a product in touch with your pamphlets that is not glassine. Something like a Mylar L sleeve would be great. The Mylar L sleeves, of course, should be purchased from a conservation supplier so that you know that they are polyester. You mentioned Mylar L sleeves, which is great because anytime that you can use an L sleeve instead of an envelope that has a seam on 3 sides, that's great. Because the L sleeve will allow you to turn the top corner of the L sleeve back and very gently insert the pamphlet into the sleeve rather than kind of jamming it into the envelope that's sealed on 3 sides. Now, all that being said, that recommendation was given under the assumption that the pamphlets don't have any friable media on the covers or within them. If there are any pencil drawings or pastel or otherwise flaking media in the pamphlets, you would not want to choose a Mylar L sleeve because the Mylar has a slight static charge to it and it could potentially lift some of that pigment off of your pamphlets. But yes, so let's, if you can, try and change out the glassine with a Mylar sleeve. And then you mentioned using the additional layer of a 4-flap enclosure. And I think that's terrific. I am a huge fan of 4-flap enclosures. And in your case, I think for a variety of reasons. First of all, those pamphlets probably have a little bit of thickness to them. So the 4-flap enclosure can be folded in a way that gives a little bit of depth so that there's not too much pressure on the cover or the back page of the pamphlet. There's a little bit of wiggle room, if you will, within a 4-flap enclosure. And the 4 flaps will give the pamphlet some nice rigidity. So it's lending some structure to the pamphlets, that would be great. I think one last thing I would mention, Elaine, in your scenario is that you are mentioning 4-flap archival enclosures. Archival is kind of a tricky descriptive word, and depending on where you're sourcing your material for your 4-flap enclosures from, just double check and make sure that the board for the enclosures is acid-free and lignin-free, and not necessarily just described by only the word archival information to us. What is more helpful is if we know that that material is acid-free and lignin-free. You probably would also want to choose a 20-point board to make those enclosures because the 20-point is a little more thick. It's a little stiffer than the 10-point board. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks, Elaine. Okay. We have another question here. So someone is asking about making choices between paper or clear polyester enclosures for photographs, which is more beneficial. That's kind of a tricky question. And I believe the answer would have more to do with how your users want to access the documents or the photographs that you're putting inside the enclosures. For example, a paper enclosure, a paper envelope, that's sealed on 3 sides, that is made of paper is obviously opaque. So it's really difficult to tell what the artifact inside is without actually pulling it out. So if you are working with a collection that gets a lot of use and could potentially be pulled in and out of its envelope fairly often, those paper envelopes are not the best choice. In that particular case, a clear polyester envelope would be better because the user can see the image or the text of the artifact without having to pull it out. The opaque paper envelopes are nice because they block light. So I guess I would also think about if you could use the clear envelopes and then keep all of the clear envelopes in a box so that there were some protection from UV and natural light. You would be a little bit, it would be better, you know, the light to protect from the light, but using the plastic envelopes would still be beneficial. Make sure that the envelopes that you choose pass the PAT test if there are photographs inside. It's pretty labeled in the vendor supply catalog that whatever envelopes you choose have passed that photograph activity test. Oh, are we back? Let's see. Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened there. I just lost the meeting, but I'm back in. Continuing to read your question, which is, can you give any recommendations for housing a large quantity of dried plant floral specimen fragments from the 50s through the 70s? They were simply collected and dried by the collector, and they're not the most exemplary specimens. Right now, many are in browning wax paper, stuffed in envelopes, etc. Mounting them is not an option for us, and I haven't determined how to store them flat while maximizing space and keeping them from slipping around. I've considered non-static polyethylene L sleeves or divided sleeves. Do you have any other ideas? This is a great question following on the heels of the last question, which had to consider sliding in and out of sleeves repeatedly. It sounds like these fragments and these floral specimens are very delicate. So I can understand right away why you would choose the L sleeves, just so that you don't have to slide the specimen in and out. I think that putting it in an L sleeve, it is temporarily a good idea, but perhaps not for the long term. I'm worried about the static charge in the Mylar and how that might affect the very delicate tissue of the fragments. I also think that you might be able to find or make a folio out of board or paper that contains a buffering agent that could help absorb some of the off-gassing from these materials. We have done a project here recently where some paper leaves were mounted to historic papers. And I would be happy to find out for you what the conservator or how the conservator balanced the conservation concerns of the natural specimens against the paper. And I am writing down on my list of follow-up questions to get back to you about that after I've consulted with the conservator. Let's see. I saw a question come up in the chat. Oh, okay. I have a question about, this is a question that speaks to scalability, so I really like it. This is a question from Kate. If you cannot individually enclose photographs in Mylar because that's cost prohibitive, what would be the next best recommendation? For example, if you have a box of photos separated into acid-free folders, should you separate them with interleaving paper? Sure, you could separate the photographs with interleaving paper. I don't know what kind of photographs you have, but what you would want to be weary of is a photograph that has a conservation concern on the emulsion side. So you wouldn't want to choose an interleaving paper that could potentially interact negatively with the emulsion on the photo. It seems like, I can't tell, if the photos are separated into acid-free folders, should you separate them with interleaving paper? It sounds like there is just one photograph per acid-free folder, and that's perfectly appropriate. But if you have all of those acid-free folders in a large stack, I would be worried about weight bearing on the photographs that are in the bottom of the stack. You may want to choose a paper envelope, like I had mentioned in the answer to the question a few ago. If they're not going to be accessed very readily, those paper envelopes are very inexpensive. You can buy them in large batches, and the paper option might allow you to get more envelopes, but that would only be an option for you if the photographs were not going to be accessed very often. In some cases, you can, depending on when the photographs date to, there may be a situation where a 3-ring binder scenario could work for you. And that way, maybe you have 4 or 8 photographs in an appropriate photo page. But again, we would have to be cautious about the weight bearing component of all of those pages, and the condition of the photographs. Okay, let's see what else we have. Oh, Kate is telling me that in some cases we do have multiple folders together, multiple photos together in one folder. In other cases, there is one per folder. And this is arbitrary. Yes, you can definitely use interleaving paper within the folders where there are multiple photographs. Be careful, however, that you are choosing an interleaving paper that is appropriate to your photographic process on those prints. Some interleaving papers have buffering agents in them that are not appropriate for certain photographic procedures. And those caveats should be very clearly labeled in the conservation supply catalog that you're purchasing the interleaving papers from. So just make sure, or just use an unbuffered interleaving paper. Okay, let's see. So I am dismissing some of these questions. I did this one. Okay. Oh, this is a question about textiles, but that's okay. So this question is, how might you house a large amount of velvet and tulle fabric samples? Is interleaving tissue the best option for velvet and plush fabrics? Can samples remain folded, or should every effort be made to store them flat? This is I may need to ask you a follow-up question to answer this one. So yes, interleaving tissue is the best option for storing fabrics because that interleaving tissue gives a support, obviously, to the fibers of whatever the fabric sample is. In the case of velvet, however, we know that the fibers of the velvet are particularly susceptible to creasing and crushing when they're folded. So while you do want to make a great effort to store them flat, if a fabric is already folded, you may want to consider leaving that crease folded before you place it into the box. Or a better option is to have a conservator look at the fabric before deciding whether to unfold it or not. In most cases with velvet, if there is a fold in the fabric, that particular crease is particularly vulnerable. So I would hate for you or someone on your staff to try and unfold the velvet and then create more damage than if it had just been left for the conservator. If there are, let's see. I guess I don't know if there are any embellishments on the velvet, but when you store a textile like velvet that has embellishments sewn onto it, you can use small squares of mylar to surround the embellishment, like a button or a snap, to prevent those particularly sharp embellishments from rubbing on other areas of the velvet. That would be an additional nice housing element to add before you store the velvet in the box. Interleaving tissue is definitely your best bet. Not crushed too tightly, but loose enough so that there can be minimal airflow going through the tissue as it surrounds the fabric. You can make small puffs with the tissue to support the fabric, but you can also use the interleaving tissue in between folds of the fabric. That's perfectly appropriate. So, anonymous attendee, we won't know who you are, but I like your question. It's not exactly a storage question, you're saying, but you have in your collection a World War II naval uniform that is in need of cleaning. You think that it's wool, but it's in pretty good shape otherwise. Do you think taking it to a local dry cleaner would be okay? And if so, do they need special instructions? I think you should make the minimal investment of having at least a consultation with a textile conservator. And the reason I say that is because it's a matching set. It's slacks and a blazer. So that leads me to believe that there are, in fact, embellishments on the uniform. maybe there are epaulets, buttons, let's say historic zippers, things that you wouldn't want to risk losing at a local dry cleaner. I don't feel comfortable speaking specifically to the chemicals that are used by a local dry cleaner. I'm a paper preservation specialist, not a textile conservator, but I do know that a textile conservator will be able to look at your artifact from a very holistic point of view, considering the embellishment as well as the actual fabric. I would be worried that if you take it to a local dry cleaner, you may lose some bits and bobs along the way. If you would like any additional information on who those textile conservators might be in our area, you can email me after the forum and I can give you some of that follow-up information. So we have another kind of paper question, which is, do you have any recommendations for housing collections of large, unmounted charcoal pastel drawings beyond sink matting them? I do have a recommendation. Now, this is the most excellent solution for your collection of charcoal and pastel drawings. I don't know that it would be the most scalable or the most cost-effective for your collection, but let me just tell you about the sealed package. So the sealed package is a microclimate that is created around an artifact. And in doing so, what is maintained inside the microclimate chamber is steady RH and temperature. So what would happen in building a sealed package is that the charcoal pastel drawings would be hinged to a back mat. And then to the back side would be added a rigid backboard. And over the top of the window mat that was placed over the pastel drawing would be placed a sheet of plexiglass. And sealing the plexiglass to the back mat all around would be a material called Marvel seal, which is heat sealed on all four edges. And a little microclimate is created for the pastel charcoal drawing within. And the sealed package will, as I said, maintain a steady environment for the drawings, but it also provides protection during handling. The sealed package also is resistant to water. So if there are any disaster scenarios around the drawings, the water doesn't penetrate the sealed package. The sealed package is also impenetrable from pests and other chemical pollutants in the environment. And we know that this sealed package can be maintained to the highest preservation standards for about 20 years. So you would be able to exhibit your drawings in the sealed package with a frame over them very confidently. You would be able to lend your drawings. You would be able to allow your users to hold the sealed package to access and view the drawings. That would be my recommendation. The sealed package is obviously a good option because it creates such a barrier to so many agents of deterioration for your drawings. It's long lasting, but it is more on the expensive side. I understand why you're asking the question, because charcoal and pastel, the media is so friable and delicate. You do potentially want to have it in a very secure housing. If your charcoal and pastel drawings are particularly vulnerable, you may want to consider them putting them into a sink mount like you suggested and putting them into permanent storage, but having a digital image, a digital capture made of the drawings, and then having a facsimile printed so that your users could access the information or the image in the charcoal pastel drawings, but there would be less touching and general movement to the drawings themselves. Oh, I love how all of these questions are different materials. Okay, here we have another kind of paper. So this is fun because we actually just had a situation come up here at the center that prompted a pretty in-depth conversation about newspaper clippings. And so the question posed to me now is, how about approaches to a very brittle newspaper clipping, some of which are heavily annotated with pencil, and others with something that looks like a crayon or something else that's friable. So here's where we have to get a little bit intellectual, perhaps, and a little less practical when thinking about housing for newspaper clippings. So newspapers are notoriously made of very, very poor quality paper. Newspapers have inherent vice. They turn yellow and brittle very quickly as they age, especially if the newspapers have been exposed to an improper environment or light. So you will very frequently have in your collections newspapers that are crumbling and the text is starting to disappear. So you can put newspaper clippings into a Mylar L sleeve, maybe with an interleaving paper behind it for additional rigidity. However, lots of collections, and maybe this could be appropriate for you, are considering digitizing the newspaper clippings and making facsimiles of them, so that the facsimile can be accessed with little worry. It can be touched quite often. It can be passed between users. It can even be shared with younger visitors to your institution. And the newspaper, the original clipping itself, can be either kept in permanent storage or in some cases simply discarded. I don't want to necessarily recommend in any situation that an institution discard archival material. However, the newspaper itself shouldn't be handled if it's very, very brittle. And just this week, we had an institution that was considering digitizing entire collections of newspapers, putting the original clippings into permanent storage, which would not come out again. But there are trade-offs. The thought there is that the information in the clippings could be accessed, it could be passed back and forth, they could be even displayed in your institution as a facsimile, but you really kind of want to keep your hands off the clippings because every time, if they're already brittle, you're touching them, they could potentially be disintegrating even further. The newspaper, so after you've made the decision perhaps to digitize or not, you mentioned that your clippings are heavily annotated with maybe a friable crayon, and in that case you would not want to put that clipping into the Mylar L sleeve because that very friable media can lift because of the static charge. I have also worked with an institution that not only digitized their collection of newspaper clippings, but as an educational exercise, they had students copy the information from all of the clippings onto other acid-free, basically photocopy paper, so that the text was saved. it's sort of a way to preserve the information in the newspaper clippings, but they didn't have a budget for digitization, so at least they were able to save the information on the clippings. Okay, let's see. Lots of different kinds of artifact questions are coming. Okay. Oh, this is a good one. And this is probably applicable to a lot of your collections. And it is a kind of multi-level question. So this scenario posed is from a participant who, in general, discourages putting paper artifacts into scrapbooks when they're giving talks to church historian groups. And the participant is asking, what is the most appropriate way to attach items into scrapbook pages? I have been asked myself specifically about tape that is advertised as being safe for use in archives. Is there really such a thing? The answer is no. Tape is not something that should ever be used against your paper artifacts. To your point, I know exactly what you're referring to. There are tapes on the market, and there are tapes even in conservation supply catalogs that are advertised as appropriate for archival use. I would say that that could potentially be true. However, we don't know over the long term how that advertised adhesive is really performing. Additionally, in the case of a scrapbook, it is very likely that adhesives can migrate. Like when you close the scrapbook, the adhesive used on a piece of tape on one page can potentially, because it's rubbing against another page, migrate over to the other page. And in that process, it leaves residue behind from its initial point of contact on the first page. And it also, it just spreads the adhesive to places where perhaps it wasn't intended to go. So if you don't choose an appropriate adhesive the first time around, you could even potentially be opening up your scrapbook to adhesive all over the place. So, and the people who you are talking to in your group, it seems like they may have been using these magnetic photographic scrapbooks that have the adhesive all over the whole page, and then you put down the ephemera and the photographs onto the sticky page and then pull the plastic cover over it. Those scrapbooks are not conservation quality. Any ephemera and photographs should be removed from those kinds of scrapbooks. Yeah, so long story short, no, don't use an adhesive that is even advertised as being safe for quote unquote archival use. You could feel much more comfortable recommending to your group that they use preservation quality photo corners or hinges of Japanese papers and wheat starch paste, but no tape. And given that question, then the next participant in the feed is asking me what commercial products are appropriate for stabilizing newspapers, for example, archival sprays. There really isn't one. Archival de-acidification sprays are not a conservation quality product. We don't recommend that you use them. And here is another question from Kate. How do you feel about labeling on objects themselves? For example, writing an object ID on the back of a print or a map, or labeling only on its enclosure. This is a tricky one, Kate. It's pretty common practice to label a photograph or a print on the back if you are using a graphite pencil. No Sharpie, no pen, the softest type of graphite pencil that you can find from a conservation supplier would be recommended. And always you would want to label on the back of a photograph in the margin, not in the middle of the print on the back. And of course, you would have to be concerned about the pressure that you were using on the pencil. You always want to use a very light touch. Labeling, if you can avoid it, it's recommended. And again, that's because of the potential for adhesive to migrate from a label to an object. It is appropriate for you to label an enclosure in a Sharpie or with a material that's a little bit harder than a graphite pencil, but you would want to do that without the artifact inside the enclosure. Okay, so here's a follow-up question to the scrapbook question, which is, we have a number of those photo albums in our collection where the photos are placed on the sticky photo pages. What is your recommendation? Should they be left alone or as part of the history of the item? Or should we remove the photos and risk damaging the photos on removal? So the photo removal is potentially a job for a conservator. If that is potentially not in the budget, you may want to consider digitizing your scrapbook by the page so that you are preserving this quote unquote history that you mentioned of the item. And I feel really strongly about this, in particular for a scrapbook, because the scrapbook actually tells a story in the way that the photos and the various paper ephemera are placed into the album. And you don't want to lose that. If you remove all of the items from the scrapbook and don't document the order or the design in which they were placed on the pages, you actually are losing some of the value and the story within the scrapbook. I totally agree with you in what you mentioned in your question. But yes, there is a risk that you will damage the photos when you try and remove them. So maybe digitizing the pages in their entirety would be the thing for you. And if it's in your budget to print out those photos and to group those printouts together, you could be in a way making a replication of the scrapbook, but it would be a replication that you could page through. You could still get the whole story of the volume. You could put the original into storage and you wouldn't have to worry about damaging the photos. As a follow-up to the question about labeling photos, do the graphite pencils you've recommended write successfully, so that you can read it well on the back of photos that are printed on more modern papers? So there is a pencil called, I'm just looking now, there are various levels of graphite in pencils that you can purchase for labeling photographs. And while I'm talking, I'm trying quickly to page through this catalog of conservation supplies that I have next to me to see if I can find the name of that pencil. And I believe it's called a Greta pencil. That would be appropriate for writing on more glossy modern photos. I can email you the name of the pencil after this form, but it is specifically made for more modern materials, exactly because of the question that you've posed. Yeah, it's a Greta pencil, like Greta. Okay. So here is a question about the best housing solution for folding pamphlet traveler maps that allows for keeping the maps flat, but also saves space, considering the heavy, bulky pamphlet case that also tends to tear off from the map itself. Oh, I think I know. I think I know what you mean. It is a map that folds up and then has a wrapped, almost cardstock cover that goes around it. We always try and encourage that all paper artifacts to be stored flat whenever possible. What probably happens in your case with these maps from the 1800s is when you unfold them, they have a not strictly rectangular size and they're rather large. So for the case of an oversized paper object, you would have the option, hopefully, to store those flat in an oversized folio, which could be something as simple as a 20-point board folded in half that provides protection on the back and over the top of the flattened mat. But you might also want that, I mean, adds a little bit of bulk because of the board, but not as much as if you were to mat and put it in a sink mat. If your goal is to save space, you probably would want to choose a 20-point board and make a large oversized folio for the map after it was opened. If the map is something that you need to access a lot in your collection, maybe you would want to consider a Mylar L-sleeve or encapsulation, which is a seam on 4 sides all around the map within polyester sheets. The polyester is going to be a little thinner than the 20-point board, so if there's a storage concern there, you might be able to fit more encapsulated maps into a drawer or on a shelf than a group of maps that are stored in a 20-point board folio stack. Lots of different kinds of paper artifacts you all have in your collections. We have, let's see. Okay. Let's see. We have, I guess this applies to lots of collections. One participant is asking what to do about a variety of attachments that are on documents in their paper collections, should everything be removed? In general, yes, if you come across a document in your collection that has an attachment on it, and by that I mean a paper clip, a staple, a post-it note, a colored ribbon, anything that is not part of the original paper artifact attached to it, you do want to remove that. The reason is, of course, because those attachments are made of materials that degrade at differing rates than the historic papers themselves. They can sometimes cause adverse reactions with the paper. And in some cases, the coloring, the dyes that are in the attachments can leach onto the historic papers. So you want to remove all of those things from your historic papers. There are, of course, always good intentions with the use of those attachments, because you're in general, people are usually trying to attach additional information to a historic document. You can preserve, of course, all of the information that's linked to the attachment on the historic paper. You can write down the information on a piece of acid-free paper and then file it in a folder with the historic paper, so that the text isn't really lost. It's just not permanently affixed to the original artifact. But yes, you do want to, in particular, take out staples and paper clips. Let's see. Here's a question about postage stamp storage in large quantities. I'm not sure if you mean large quantities of stamps or large sheets of stamps, but the concern there would be with the adhesive on the back of the stamp. Putting the stamps in paper envelopes could be appropriate. I would almost recommend that before you make a choice, you examine the adhesive on the back of those stamps. I'm not even thinking of the scenario in which perhaps the stamp has already been used and that adhesive has been activated. I'm more concerned with the environment in which the stamp is being stored, and perhaps the humidity of the environment could be activating some of that adhesive. So whatever housing the stamp is stored in, the back of the stamp could be sticking to the housing if the humidity is very high. I think, Ramella, I would want to do some more research for you on that particular question, and I'm happy to do so in consultation with a conservator here. If you would like to be in touch via email so that we can get some more information on how that adhesive on the back of the stamp will perform over the next, let's say, few decades, send me an email. And we can get some more information. So how would a paper document with a wax seal be housed? In most cases, the answer to that question is in a custom mat package, so that the paper document would be hinged to a backboard of preservation quality, and then spacers would be arranged around the paper document, and particularly close to the area of the wax seal, there would be a construction made of mat board to highlight the wax seal, but also to create some distance between the backboard and the window mat, so that nothing would be rubbing against the wax seal. And here is, I think, our grand finale question. We have one participant who is receiving either by donation or purchase a number of historic papers on 8.5 by 11-inch hole punched paper. That's interesting. I hope that the historic paper hasn't been hole punched. But regardless, what is your recommendation for storing these papers? Should they be placed in folders with interleaving pages? Yes, I would not place them back into a 3-ring binder. I would place them flat and with perhaps microchamber paper or another variety of interleaving paper in between the pages in folios. It would be ideal if you could put one historic page in each folder, but if that's not possible, the interleaving pages are appropriate. I'm assuming that the historic papers, despite the fact that they may have holes punched in them, that the media is stable. If the historic papers have any kind of friable inks on them, I wouldn't recommend that you place more than one in a folder because I wouldn't want them to be abrading each other on the surface. But to answer your question overall, yes, they don't go back into a 3-ring binder because you don't want the stress of pulling the historic paper pulling against those rings during the paper during flipping the pages by the user. So I will tell you that we were surprised by how many participants logged in or signed up to join us at this forum, which tells me that housing is a concern for a lot of collections. Sometimes the concerns are very specific and require thinking about not only materials, but like the usage and the mission of your institution. But we did have a lot of people try and join us today. Obviously, we can't answer all the questions in an hour in this forum format, but we had decided to follow up this forum with a Google survey, which if you are willing to participate, we are interested to hear your feedback in what kind of hands-on workshops we could offer next year in the housing topic. Perhaps there are boxes, certain kinds of hinging techniques, 4-flap enclosures, other housings that you would like to come to a workshop to learn about the materials and how to make them. Or perhaps you have a scenario that you just come into contact with a lot in your collections and you want some more information about. We would like to know about your housing specific concerns so that we can offer workshops that might give you some resources next year. Additionally, if you would like to follow up with me after this forum with your more specific or follow-up questions related to housing in your collections, I'm happy to correspond with you in that way. My email is sbailey@ccaha.org. Housing, in my mind, is a critical piece of the preservation activities that we do, and to some degree, I would argue it's the most important for some collections in which environment and usage is a little harder to control. So I would like, if you are willing, to let us know your thoughts via the Google survey that will be coming out this week. I'd like to try and get information to you and to develop curriculum to help you with your housing concerns. So that's the end of our forum and our time together. Thanks very much for joining us, and please let us know if there are other housing conundrums that you would like to chat about. Thanks very much. Have a good day.